Hi everybody. So this is going to be hopefully a quick video, very quick and to the point, about the basics of scale construction. Okay, so let's get right to it. Sorry, sharing my screen. All right. So the first thing we want to keep in mind is to keep your questions simple. I mean, that's the easiest rule to abide by, or at least it seems like it would be. Because very often when we come up with questions, our questions are convoluted. They're not straightforward. They include multiple different aspects. So for example, you might ask someone, to what extent do they think about and long for the past? And you may be thinking, oh, that's the same question. That's one question. That's coherent. That's actually two different questions, all right? And so you've needlessly complicated what could be two simple questions. And so in general, some things to keep in mind. You want to keep your questions simply worded. All right. Don't use fancy words. Remember that the average person reads at something like an 8th grade reading level. All right. So if you use language that they may not be familiar with, they're probably not going to give you the response or even be answering the question you were asking them. All right. So you want to be simply worded. You don't want to use any jargon. If you use jargon, which is sometimes you need to, you want to carefully, clearly, and simply define that jargon for them. All right. And like I said, don't use any $10 words. Don't use any advanced vocabulary. All right. Keep your questions short. All right. So, even that question that I mentioned earlier, right? To what extent do you think about the past and long for it? That's not too long, but because you have two questions, you could break it up into two shorter questions. To what extent do you think about the past? To what extent do you long for the past? Right? The difference in lengths of those questions isn't terrible. Again, remember, length wasn't really the problem in the first question of the original question. But in general, if you keep them simple, if you keep them short, and you keep them straight to the point, then your participants are going to have an easier time understanding what you're asking them and giving you a good response. You want to keep your questions straightforward. Don't needlessly complicate them. Okay, so you might avoid, or you should avoid, double-barrel questions. So that question we've been playing with so far, to what extent do you think about and long for the past? That's a double-barreled question. You're really asking two questions in there instead of just one. Now you may be thinking, well, that's all one question, but it's not. All right, because some people may think about the past but not really long for it, while others may long for the past but hardly ever actually think about it. So even when double-barrel questions seem like they're asking the same question, it's best to break them up. And in general, it's best to have multiple questions about a construct than it is a single question about that construct. And that will play its way out into several other things we're going to talk about today. You also want to present any conditional information first. So, for example, if I wanted you to tell me how positively you thought about your university, all right, without considering any of the negative aspects, well, I would first ask you to set aside all the negative aspects and then report how positively you evaluate your university. So, because the condition is, in the absence of any negative evaluations, how positively do you evaluate this thing? So the conditional information is, in the absence of any negative information or negative evaluations. So you want to present that condition first. All right. It's always also best to avoid any kind of negatively worded question. Instead of would you prefer to not stop, try would you prefer to continue. Okay. Now you may be thinking, well, that one's a silly example. And you're right, that is a silly example. But occasionally you will see questions that involve negations. All right. So a negation is when you give them an idea and then you undo it. You require them to undo it. So for example, you say, so the idea is negated. So you might say, well, in that question, would you prefer not to stop? So would you prefer to stop is the thing that they first have to identify, and then they have to realize that you're asking them, would they prefer to not stop? When even thinking about that, even explaining it is hard to do because negations aren't the easiest thing to think about. So instead, anytime you find yourself working the negation into a question, work it out. All right. Instead, opt for a question that is more straightforward. All right. So, to what extent would you prefer to continue? In general, just avoid overly complicated questions. If it's too long, it's probably overcomplicated. All right. Find a way to break it down into more questions that are simpler. It's better to have more questions that are simpler than it is to have fewer questions that are more complicated. Okay. You also want to, when you're constructing your questions, you want to construct your questions in a way that you can avoid response biases. And you can see a little list of some response biases right here, right? Some people prefer to respond in an extreme way, so they'll only respond, like if you have a 1 to 7 scale, they'll only respond with 1s or 7s. Some people prefer to hang out in the middle, so on a 1 to 7 scale, they may only respond with a 4, maybe a 3, maybe a 5, but usually a 4. That's a neutral response bias. Some people may just respond with the same value all the way through, so on a 1 to 7 scale, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, or 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right? So one way that we can at least start to get around that is by changing the order of our questions. So for example, if I was trying to ask a series of questions that assessed how satisfied a person is with their life, right? I might ask, sorry for the shakes, how happy are you with your life? How satisfied are you with your life choices? And if I give them a 1 to 7 scale, 1 being not at all, 7 being extremely, then their answers to both of these questions are going to be consistent, right? If they give me a 7 on this one and a 6 on this one, both of those indicate being fairly satisfied. But if we look at this question here, do you feel as though you would change many of your decisions? Well, if they give me a 6 on that, that's telling me that they regret a lot of their decisions, all right, which is also a simpler way to write that question. Do you regret many of your life decisions, right? If they answer, that's really what I want to know. If they answer a 6 or a 7, that's telling me the opposite of them being satisfied. That's telling me that they're not satisfied. All right. So we work in questions like this because if a person's just going through and giving you the same answer to every question, or basically the same answer to every question, then they're likely to miss questions like these. All right. But if they're genuinely responding, then a genuine answer if someone genuinely was satisfied with their life and they were genuinely answering our questions, then they would respond to this question with like a 2, right? Maybe a 3. And then because anytime you have multiple questions in a scale assessing the same thing, you've got to aggregate the scores. And so when we would aggregate, what we would do is we would reverse code this item. And when we reverse code, you take the highest possible value on the scale as a 1 to 7 scale. So you take 7. You then add 1 to it, so that's 8, and then subtract the scale response. So let's say somebody gave us a 7 on this one, a 6 on this one, and then a 2 on that one. Well, on this one, we're going to reverse code it, right? So we would take 7, the highest value on the scale, plus 1, 8, and then subtract from it the scale response, which was 2. 8 minus 2 is 6. Then, now that we've done this, our responses are 7 to this one, 6 to this one, and now, because it's reverse coded, 6 on this one. And so we get a pretty clear picture that this guy that's responding this way is satisfied with their life. All right? So that's one way to get around response biases. Now, another thing to consider when you're making surveys is when people are writing or responding to surveys, they're engaging in a little bit of impression management. Now, what that means is that they're trying to make sure that the researcher or whoever might look at their data think well of them. And that can cause social desirability issues. And it doesn't always happen, and there's things we can do to get around it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's a potential problem with survey research. And one reason survey responses may not always correlate well with real behavior. Another problem is that even if you ask them hypothetical question, like what would you do in the situation, they're giving you what they think they would do, but they're giving you what they think they would do without any real access to their inner motives or what they do in a real situation, because in general people don't have introspective insight, right? They don't have access to all of the reasons they behave the way they do, and even when they do, they don't always think about it. So especially with surveys, people oftentimes just try to speed through it. And so if you're asking them to, asking them some kind of insightful question, chances are they're not going to give you an insightful answer. Even if they have the ability to do so, they may not be motivated to do so. And so they may not think carefully about your question. Even if they are, they may still be wanting you to think highly of them, or whoever looks at their data to think highly of them. And so social desirability works its way into the responses. Now, there's some ways we can deal with that. So, for example, one easy way is to just emphasize that all the responses will be anonymous. And so there's no way to, if we're asking sensitive questions, there's no way we'll be telling them that there's no way that we'll be ever be able to identify whose responses are whose might incline them to give us genuine answers. It might not, but at least that's something we can do to increase the chances. We can also ask indirect questions. If I'm asking, if I'm interested in how satisfied the person with their life is with their life, if I ask them the direct question, how satisfied are you with your life, right? Because of the seemingly innocuous, because of how unoffensive that question is, they may try to give me a genuine answer. But they may not consider certain things, right? Going back to some of that introspective insight. Or they may be trying to play good, right? They may want you to think that their life is better than it is. On social media, we get a lot of playing good. People trying to put on their best face, only posting the best pictures, only posting the most exciting posts, right? So they're playing good. Well, one way we can get around situations, so if I ask directly, how satisfied are you with your life? They may give me an answer that is somewhat colored by what they want me to think of them. And so instead we ask indirect questions, right? And so we might ask things like, well, some of those questions we were talking about on the last page, right? So, do you regret your life choices? How satisfied are you with your life choices? Things like that. And so by not asking the question directly, we can, and asking, and kind of asking questions that revolve around it, but don't address it directly. By aggregating all of those indirect questions, we can get an idea of the variable that we're trying to measure indirectly. Okay. Sometimes, especially when there's this strong impression management motive, this strong motive to have others think well of us, and we're asking about something that is very questionable, right? We might pull the question away from them entirely and ask them about somebody else, right? So, if they like to drink, but they don't want people to think they're a lush, right? Instead of asking them how much they drink, and then which would activate some of that concern they might have for people thinking negatively of them, leading them to underreport how much they actually drink, we might ask, in general, something about others. Is it okay for people to drink? Imagine you saw a person at a bar drinking 4 drinks. how negatively would you evaluate this person? So I'm asking questions about other people, but I'm really getting their attitude about heavy drinking. And so that tells me a little bit, again, if I do this enough and I ask enough questions that are indirect but all related to the thing that I'm trying to measure, this gives me an idea, a roundabout idea, again, aggregating across question, about what I want to know about the participant. Okay? And that, my friends, is that. Okay? Ooh, earthquake. All right. So if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to send those my way. If not, then I hope this video is useful. And you know, like I said, reach out to me with any questions you might have. I'm sorry for my lethargic nature. I honestly feel like I could set my head down and fall straight asleep. I'm sorry for that. But hopefully this video is useful despite my exhausted veneer. All right, guys. Have a great one. I'll talk to you later.